She plugged into my cabin's power every day, bold and titled like it was part of her property. I saw the cord on day 1. I let it slide on day 2. By day 5, I realized this wasn't a mistake. It was a message. Where I live, we don't have fences. But that doesn't mean we don't have boundaries. And when someone like her crosses the line, you either report it or get creative. She thought she was draining power. But the truth, that current was flowing both ways. Would you have stopped her or let karma finish the job? Comment below. I'm Miles Thompson, and at 30 years old, I thought I had my life figured out. After 10 years as a police chief, I was burned out and ready for something different. So, when I found this perfect cabin in the Virginia mountains surrounded by tall pines and far from chaos, I knew it was exactly what I needed. 2 acres, a small creek, and neighbors who seemed friendly enough. What could go wrong? I signed the papers and moved in on a crisp October morning. The first few weeks were perfect. Birds singing instead of sirens, coffee on the porch, watching deer falling asleep to wind through trees instead of traffic. I started a garden, built a fire pit, began woodworking projects I'd always promised myself. But around the 3rd week, something changed. Every afternoon between 2 and 4 o'clock, this horrible smell would drift across my property. At first I thought maybe a dead animal in the woods, but this smell was different, sharp acidic, so foul it made my eyes water. I spent hours, but the smell didn't add up. There was no leak, no animal carcass, just that same unbearable stench. My septic tank was relatively new, replaced 2 years before, and I'd had it inspected during purchase. The smell wasn't from my system. It came from somewhere else, drifting over with the afternoon breeze. I should have known something was wrong when I noticed the smell only happened on weekdays. Weekends were fine. Clean mountain air, just like I'd expected. I started noticing a disturbing pattern. The smell was always there between 2 and 4 o'clock. Too regular to be a coincidence. Someone was causing this on schedule. One afternoon, while gagging from that stench instead of enjoying lunch on my porch, I noticed something I'd overlooked. An orange extension cord running along my fence line, hidden by overgrown grass. I followed it and realized it came from my property, ran under my fence, and disappeared toward my neighbor's house. I'd met Miley Grant when I first moved in. She was the HOA chairwoman, exactly 45 years old, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She'd introduced herself as the community coordinator and handed me a thick packet of rules I needed to follow for everyone's benefit. I thought she was just thorough, maybe overly organized, but harmless. I figured I'd keep my head down and avoid conflicts. After all, I'd moved here for peace, not neighborhood drama. But now, seeing that orange cord running from my property to hers, I wondered if Miley was more problematic than I'd thought. I walked to my cabin's back and found something that made my stomach drop. An old electrical outlet on the exterior wall right next to my septic tank location. I'd noticed it during walkthrough, but hadn't thought much about it. The previous owner mentioned installing it for a backup water pump never used. The outlet was functional, had power, and now I could see fresh scratches around the plug. That evening, I couldn't shake the feeling I was missing something important. My cop instinct said this wasn't coincidence. The smell, timing, the mysterious cord, the unused outlet near my septic system, it felt connected. By nightfall, I knew it was time to find out what was really going on. I waited until around 10 o'clock, then quietly made my way to the fence line, following that orange cord through shadows. What I heard from the other side made my blood run cold. A motor running mechanical and rhythmic like a pump. I crept closer to the fence, then the motor stopped. Silence. I heard footsteps fading away toward her house. I stood there in the darkness for what felt like hours, trying to process what I'd witnessed. Someone was definitely using electrical power from my property to run some kind of equipment, and based on the timing and location, I had a terrible suspicion about what that equipment might be doing. And let me tell you, after 10 years of dealing with the worst humanity had to offer, I thought I'd seen everything. Walking back to my cabin that night, I felt the familiar weight of an investigation settling on my shoulders. This wasn't just a neighbor dispute or a simple misunderstanding. Someone was deliberately using my property for something, and given the smell, the timing, and the secrecy, I had a feeling it was something illegal. I'd spent enough years in law enforcement to recognize when something was seriously wrong. I stared at that orange cord disappearing into the darkness, and something in my gut told me this was either going to be the answer to my problems or the beginning of something much, much worse. The next morning, I decided to take a systematic approach. Years of police work taught me evidence collection was everything. I started documenting times when the smell appeared, weather conditions, the exact path of that extension cord, and I needed visual proof. My instincts told me this wasn't a simple mistake. After dealing with criminals for a decade, my instincts rarely steered me wrong. Around noon, I was making lunch when I heard a sharp knock. I opened it to find Miley Grant on my porch, clipboard in hand, wearing a floral dress and that artificial smile. "Good afternoon, Miles," she said, trying too hard to sound friendly. "I'm here for a routine property inspection to ensure everything meets community standards." She gestured toward my yard. "I've noticed your grass is getting long. According to HOA regulations, lawn height can't exceed 3 inches, and yours appears to be pushing 4. I had to stop and stare. I stepped onto the porch and looked at my yard, then back at her. "Miley, my grass looks fine. It's barely October, still growing season, and I mowed less than a week ago." She made a note, shaking her head with exaggerated disappointment. "I understand you're new to community living, but we have standards everyone needs to follow. These rules exist to maintain property values and neighborhood character." The way she said neighborhood character made something cold settle in my stomach. "I'll need you to address this by week's end, or we'll discuss a fine." After she left, I walked around the block to compare my grass to everyone else's. What I found was infuriating, but predictable. Miley's own yard had areas where grass was significantly longer than mine, including a section near her back fence that looked uncut for weeks. My neighbors had virtually identical grass length. This wasn't about community standards. This was targeted harassment, and I was starting to understand her real game. Looking back, I can't believe how obvious her manipulation was, but I was trying to give her the benefit of the doubt. That afternoon, I bought a security camera designed to look like a decorative garden rock. I'd used similar equipment during surveillance operations and knew exactly where to position it for the best view of that mysterious cord and whatever was happening on the other side of my fence. I spent about an hour setting it up, well hidden, but with clear line of sight to the electrical outlet and the area where I had heard that motor. The camera had motion activation and night vision, so it would capture whatever happened during those afternoon incidents. The next day brought another visit from Miley, this time complaining about my excessive outdoor lighting. I had exactly 2 small solar path lights leading to my front door, the same kind that probably half the neighborhood used. These lights create unnecessary glare that disturbs the natural ambiance of our community. She explained again with that clipboard and that tone that suggested I was personally responsible for ruining everyone's quality of life. I wasn't sure if I should laugh or lose my temper, but I managed to keep my voice level. "Miley, these are standard solar lights that turn on automatically at dusk." That evening, I checked the footage from my hidden camera, and what I saw made my hands shake with anger. There was Miley, clear as day, walking across her yard with a heavy-duty extension cord in her hands. She plugged it into my outlet, then disappeared back toward her property. Within minutes, I could hear that motor starting up, the same rhythmic pumping sound I'd noticed the night before. But the most damning part came about 20 minutes later, when I saw a dark liquid beginning to flow from what appeared to be a hidden pipe near the base of the large oak tree. I watched the footage 3 times, making sure I wasn't misunderstanding what I was seeing. There was no question about it. Miley was using my electricity to power some kind of pump that was moving liquid waste from her property onto mine. The timing matched perfectly with the smell incidents, and the visual evidence was undeniable. I'd caught her red-handed stealing my electricity and using it to dump what appeared to be sewage onto my land. Was it just about saving money on her utility bill, or was there something even more twisted going on here? Either way, this was way beyond neighborhood disputes. I had the proof. Now it was time to confront her, but would she admit it? Around lunchtime, I heard that familiar motor starting up again. This time, instead of just recording it, I decided to get a closer look at exactly what was being pumped onto my property. I grabbed a long stick and carefully approached the drainage area near the oak tree. What I found there made me physically ill. Mixed in with the brown liquid were pieces of toilet paper, clearly identifiable waste matter, and the unmistakable smell of raw sewage. This wasn't gray water from a washing machine or kitchen sink. I stood there, staring at the evidence, feeling a combination of disgust and rage that I hadn't experienced since my worst days in law enforcement. This woman, who had the unmitigated gall to come to my door complaining about grass height and solar lights, was literally dumping her sewage onto my property while lecturing me about community standards. The hypocrisy was so outrageous that I actually laughed out loud, though there was nothing funny about the situation. As I watched that brown liquid flowing onto my land, I realized I had two choices: confront her now, with partial evidence, or wait, and risk discovering something even more disgusting. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought about what I'd seen flowing onto my property and the sheer audacity of someone doing that while pretending to care about community standards. By morning, I decided to confront Miley directly with my evidence, in a way that left no room for denial. After 10 years in law enforcement, I'd learned the direct approach often caught people off guard and forced them to reveal more than intended. Time to see how good an actress our HOA chairwoman really was. The footage was clear. I had proof. Now I needed to act. I spent the morning reviewing footage, taking screenshots of the clearest images, and organizing everything into an undisputable timeline. The evidence was overwhelming. Multiple instances of her plugging into my outlet, the motor running waste flowing onto my property, all captured in high definition with time stamps. I also took soil samples from the contaminated area and sealed them in plastic bags, though I was sure I wouldn't need scientific analysis to prove what any reasonable person could see and smell. Around 2 o'clock, right on schedule, I heard that motor start. This time, instead of watching from distance, I marched straight to Miley's front door and knocked firmly. When she answered, I could see surprise, and then quick concern cross her face. She was still holding the remote control for whatever pump system she was using, though she quickly tried hiding it behind her back. "Miles, what a surprise. Is everything all right?" Her voice had that same artificial sweetness, but now I could hear nervousness underneath. Oh, this was going to be fun. I held up my phone and showed her the clearest screenshot from my security footage. It showed her clearly plugging the extension cord into my outlet with a timestamp from just 2 days earlier. "Miley, what's going on with the outlet?" For just a moment, maybe 3 seconds, I saw her mask slip completely. Her eyes went wide, her mouth opened slightly, and she looked exactly like someone who'd just been caught doing something they knew was wrong. But then so quickly I almost thought I'd imagined it. Her expression shifted to confusion and then indignation. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said, though her voice was higher than normal, and she was gripping that remote control so tightly her knuckles were white. I showed her another screenshot, this one clearly showing the brown liquid flowing from the pipe near our property line. "This is what's been causing that horrible smell every afternoon. You're pumping waste from your septic system onto my property using my electricity." She looked at the image for a long moment, and I could practically see her mind racing, trying to figure out how to handle this situation. What came next was a masterclass in manipulation that honestly impressed me, even while it infuriated me. Miley's entire demeanor changed. Her shoulders relaxed, her voice dropped to a more reasonable tone, and she looked at me with what seemed like genuine concern. "Oh, Miles, I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. What you're seeing there is just natural runoff from my drainage system. We've had so much rain lately, and the water has to go somewhere. I would never do anything to harm a neighbor's property." She gestured toward the screenshot with the kind of patient expression you'd use on a confused child. My stomach churned. This wasn't just a neighbor dispute, it was a crime. "Miley, this isn't rainwater. I've tested the soil where this liquid drains and it's contaminated with human waste. Plus, I have video of you manually plugging and unplugging equipment from my electrical outlet." She shook her head slowly, as if dealing with someone who was having trouble understanding simple concepts. "I think you might be letting your imagination run away with you. Sometimes when people move from busy city environments to quiet rural areas, they can become hypersensitive to normal country smells and activities." But then she escalated even further, and this is where it got really interesting. "I'm actually concerned about your behavior, Miles. Following neighbors around, setting up cameras, making wild accusations about perfectly normal drainage issues. This kind of obsessive monitoring isn't healthy, and frankly, it's making other residents uncomfortable." She pulled out her phone and made a show of opening her contacts. "I think it might be best if I contacted some local mental health resources to help you adjust to rural living. There are professionals who specialize in helping people transition from high-stress careers to peaceful retirement communities." That was the moment I realized I wasn't dealing with someone who had made a mistake or gotten desperate about a septic problem. This was someone who was actively malicious, someone who would pump sewage onto her neighbor's property and then try to convince him he was crazy for objecting to it. The way she so smoothly transitioned from denial to victim blaming to questioning my mental state showed a level of calculated manipulation that honestly made my skin crawl. Looking back, I should have known right then that this was going to get much worse before it got better. "Miley," I said, keeping my voice as calm and professional as I could manage, "I have clear video evidence of what you've been doing, soil samples that can be tested, and documentation of every incident. This isn't about mental health or adjustment issues. This is about theft of utilities and illegal disposal of waste." She stared at me for a moment, and I could see her recalculating her approach. When she spoke again, her voice had gone completely cold, and for the first time I was seeing the real person behind all that fake community leader nonsense. "If you continue to harass me with these ridiculous accusations, I'll have no choice but to contact my attorney. What you're doing constitutes stalking, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I've been nothing but welcoming to you since you moved here, and this is how you repay community kindness." She stepped closer, lowering her voice to almost a whisper. "I would hate to see you face legal consequences for behavior that's clearly stemming from some kind of personal crisis, but I will protect myself and this community if necessary." I looked at her standing there, threatening me with lawsuits for documenting her illegal dumping of sewage onto my property, and I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about the smell anymore, or even about the theft and contamination. This was about someone who was so entitled, so convinced of her own authority, that she believed she could commit crimes against her neighbors and then intimidate them into silence when they objected. Well, she'd picked the wrong retired cop to mess with, and she was about to find out exactly how wrong. "We'll settle this at an emergency HOA meeting," I said simply. "I'll be presenting all my evidence to the board and requesting your immediate removal from any position of authority." Her confident mask slipped again just for a second, but long enough for me to see that underneath all that bluster she was genuinely worried about facing consequences for what she'd been doing. She tried to recover quickly, but it was too late. I'd seen the fear in her eyes, and now I knew she could be beaten. I watched the footage. I had the evidence, but would she deny it? And if she did, what? Then, walking away from her door, I wondered if I'd just made the smartest move of my life, or if I'd just declared war on someone who played dirtier than I ever imagined. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening at 7 o'clock in the community center. I had all the proof now. It was time to confront her with it. I organized my evidence chronologically, created clear photo displays showing the illegal dumping, and even prepared soil samples in labeled containers. I wasn't just going to accuse Miley of wrongdoing, I was going to prove it beyond any reasonable doubt. And if that didn't work well, I had a few backup plans that I'd learned during my years dealing with people who thought they were smarter than the law. The night of the meeting, I arrived early and set up my materials at the front of the room. I'd invited every board member except Miley, sending them each a preliminary evidence packet so they could review the situation beforehand. As residents began filing in, I could see the tension in the room. Word had gotten around that there was going to be a serious confrontation, and people were curious about what had been happening between the new guy and their longtime chairwoman. I wasn't sure if they would side with evidence or loyalty, but I was about to find out. And honestly, after dealing with small-town politics during my police career, I had a pretty good idea which way this was going to go. Miley arrived fashionably late, dressed in her most professional-looking outfit and carrying a thick folder of her own materials. She greeted everyone warmly, making sure to hug the older residents and ask about their families. I had to admit she was good at working a room. She positioned herself as the caring community leader who had unfortunately been forced to deal with a difficult situation. When she looked at me, her expression was sad and disappointed, like a patient teacher dealing with a problem student. The performance was really quite impressive if you ignored the fact that she'd been pumping literal sewage onto my property for weeks. I began my presentation by laying out the timeline of events, starting with the mysterious afternoon smells and leading up to the discovery of the illegal dumping operation. I showed the video footage on a laptop connected to the community center's projector so everyone could see exactly what had been happening. The evidence was crystal clear. Miley plugging into my outlet, the motor running, the sewage flowing onto my property. Several board members looked genuinely shocked, covering their noses when I described the smell and showed photos of the contaminated area. So far, so good. Maybe this was going to be easier than I thought. But then Miley stood up and I watched her work her political magic in real time. She didn't deny the evidence directly. Instead, she reframed the entire situation in a way that was honestly brilliant, if completely evil. "I'm heartbroken that it's come to this. She began, her voice trembling slightly with what appeared to be genuine emotion. When Miles moved to our community, I tried so hard to make him feel welcome. I personally delivered his welcome packet, answered all his questions about local services, even recommended the best places to shop for home improvement supplies. She paused, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. But from almost the first week, his behavior became increasingly concerning. She painted a picture of me as an unstable newcomer who couldn't adjust to rural living and had become obsessed with monitoring his neighbors. The amount of surveillance equipment he's installed is frankly frightening. Cameras pointed at neighboring properties, recording devices, even what appears to be some kind of soil testing kit. This isn't normal behavior for someone who just wants to fit into a peaceful community. Some of the board members were nodding along, and I could see doubt creeping into their expressions. Was it possible they were actually buying this garbage? Well, I guess when you've been manipulating people for years, you get pretty good at it. When she pulled out her own folder and began showing photos of my security camera, my outdoor lighting, and even my garden tools, I realized how thoroughly she'd prepared for this confrontation. She'd documented everything that could possibly be presented as evidence of paranoid or aggressive behavior. I've tried to address his concerns through normal HOA channels, offering reasonable solutions for the minor drainage issues that can occur in any rural property. But instead of working with the community, he's chosen to manufacture a conspiracy theory that paints me as some kind of criminal. The woman was good, I'll give her that. Evil, but good at being evil. The room was quiet for a long moment after she finished. I could see the board members looking back and forth between us, trying to decide what to believe. These were people who had known Miley for years, who had trusted her to manage their community affairs. I was a stranger who had lived here for less than 2 months and was now accusing their respected chairwoman of pumping sewage onto my property. When you put it that way, I could understand their hesitation. But then something unexpected happened that completely changed the dynamic in the room. An older gentleman named Robert Peterson, who lived 3 houses down from me, cleared his throat and stood up. "If I may," he said quietly, "I think there might be more to this situation than we initially realized." He looked directly at Miley, his expression serious. "Miley, I've been meaning to talk to you about some irregularities I've noticed in our HOA financial records, specifically some utility expenses that don't seem to match up with our actual community facilities." The room went completely silent. This wasn't part of either of our presentations, but suddenly everyone was paying very close attention. And from the look on Miley's face, this was not going according to her plan. The meeting ended without any formal resolution, but I could tell that seeds of doubt had been planted about Miley's version of events. As people filed out, several residents approached me quietly to share their own stories about questionable HOA management and concerns they had been afraid to voice. It became clear that my sewage problem was just the tip of the iceberg when it came to Miley's abuse of authority, but I also realized that exposing her publicly was going to require more than just evidence. It was going to require a strategy that accounted for her political skills and her willingness to play as dirty as necessary to protect her position. Walking home that night, I felt both encouraged and concerned. Encouraged because I wasn't alone in recognizing that something was seriously wrong with how our community was being managed. Concerned because I now understood that Miley wasn't just someone who had made a bad decision about waste disposal. She was someone who had built a system of control and financial manipulation, and she wasn't going to give up that power without a fight. The question was, how far was she willing to go to protect herself? And more importantly, how creative was I going to have to get to make sure she faced real consequences for what she'd been doing? The next morning, she showed up again. This time, she wasn't just complaining, she was threatening me. At this point, would you have stopped there, or would the sweet taste of revenge make you want to push things even further? 3 days after the HOA meeting, I received a certified letter that made my blood run cold. From Patterson Williams and Associates, one of the state's most expensive law firms. The letter hit me like a punch, accusations of stalking and harassment. They were demanding $5,000 in damages, plus my agreement to never discuss the sewage allegations with anyone. So, apparently documenting crimes now counted as harassment. Who knew? They thought they could intimidate me with a letter. They were wrong. The letter went on to threaten a full lawsuit if I didn't comply within 10 days. They claimed evidence of my obsessive and increasingly dangerous behavior, and suggested my inability to adjust to rural community living had resulted in delusional accusations against a respected community leader. But you know what I'd spent 10 years dealing with people who thought that they could intimidate their way out of consequences for illegal behavior. The expensive lawyers and threats just confirmed Miley knew exactly what she'd been doing and was desperate to avoid accountability. If she wanted to play hardball with high-priced attorneys, fine. I'd let the government lawyers handle it. Because here's what Miley didn't understand about messing with a retired cop. We know exactly which agencies to call when someone breaks federal environmental laws. I contacted the EPA and local health authorities. This wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore, it was a crime. I sent each agency a comprehensive complaint package that included all my video evidence, photographs, soil samples, documentation of electrical theft, and a detailed timeline. When federal agencies get involved, expensive private attorneys suddenly don't seem so scary. Within days, I had government agencies on the case. This was bigger than I had imagined. An EPA inspector named Carol Williams called me personally to schedule a site visit. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "based on your documentation, this appears to be a serious environmental violation with potential health consequences for the surrounding area. We'll need to conduct soil and water testing, and we'll also be interviewing the alleged perpetrator." I could hear the professional interest in her voice, the tone of someone who'd seen plenty of environmental crimes and knew exactly how to handle them. The investigation was underway. I watched as government vehicles pulled up, and for the first time I felt like the tide was turning in my favor, but I still wasn't sure if it would be enough. I watched from my kitchen window as Inspector Williams and her team methodically documented everything I'd reported and more. They took extensive soil samples, photographed the drainage area, tested the electrical outlet for evidence of unauthorized usage, and even brought some kind of electronic equipment that could detect septic waste contamination. The whole process took about 4 hours, and I could see Miley watching nervously from her own windows the entire time. Around noon, the inspection team moved to Miley's property. I couldn't see everything that was happening, but I could hear raised voices and what sounded like a very tense conversation. About an hour later, Inspector Williams knocked on my door with an update that made me smile for the first time in weeks. "Mr. Thompson, we've confirmed multiple environmental violations on the neighboring property. The septic system has been illegally modified to pump waste onto your land, and we've documented clear evidence of utility theft. We're issuing immediate cease and desist orders along with fines totaling $25,000. But wait, it gets better. Inspector Williams explained that when they'd confronted Miley about the violations, she'd made what she called several tactical errors that turned a simple environmental violation into something much more serious. First, she'd tried to deny everything, despite being confronted with undeniable physical evidence. Then, when that didn't work, she'd attempted to influence the investigation by name-dropping local political connections and suggesting that a community leader of her standing shouldn't be subject to the same regulations as everyone else. Finally, and most damagingly, she'd actually offered to make a donation to some environmental fund if they could work something out privately. That last part is what really got her in trouble, Williams explained, with the kind of professional satisfaction that comes from catching someone in a really stupid mistake. Attempted bribery of federal officials is a serious crime. We've referred that aspect of the case to the U.S. Attorney's Office for potential prosecution. She handed me a copy of the official violation notice. The septic modification has to be removed immediately. The contaminated soil on your property will be cleaned up at her expense, and she's being assessed the maximum allowable fine under state environmental law. Plus, we're recommending that the HOA remove her from any leadership position immediately. That afternoon, I received another certified letter, but this one was much more satisfying to read. It was from the HOA board, informing me that Miley Grant had been suspended from her position as chairwoman, pending a full review of financial irregularities and conduct violations. The letter also mentioned that several other residents had come forward with complaints about unauthorized HOA expenses and questionable decision-making during her tenure. Apparently, my situation had opened the floodgates for people who had been afraid to speak up before. Funny how that works when bullies finally face real consequences for their behavior. The next morning, I was drinking coffee on my porch when I saw Miley in her yard, standing next to a large truck with emergency septic services painted on the side. 2 workers were digging up a section of her property near our shared fence line, and from her body language, she was not happy about the expense or the disruption. When she noticed me watching, she walked to the fence and glared at me with pure hatred. "I hope you're satisfied," she called out. You've destroyed my reputation and cost me a fortune, all because you couldn't handle a little country living. A little country living. That's what she called pumping sewage onto my property. I stood up and walked to the fence, looking her directly in the eyes. Miley, you pumped raw sewage onto my property, using my own electricity while lecturing me about community standards. The only thing I did was document your crimes and report them to the appropriate authorities. She started to respond, but I held up my hand. You had every opportunity to stop this behavior when I first confronted you. Instead, you tried to gaslight me, threaten me with lawsuits, and attempted to bribe federal officials. You did this to yourself. And honestly, watching her stand there next to a septic truck facing $25,000 in fines and potential federal charges, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete professional satisfaction. But as I watched the investigators drive away, something told me Miley wasn't the type to go down without one final desperate fight. The question was no longer whether she'd retaliate, but how far she'd go to drag me down with her. And frankly, I wasn't sure I was prepared for what someone with nothing left to lose might be willing to do. Over the next few weeks, our community transformation was remarkable. With Miley suspended and facing legal consequences, residents came forward with stories about her authority abuse going back years. Robert Peterson organized gatherings where people shared experiences and discussed preventing this situation again. What emerged was a pattern of financial manipulation, selective rule enforcement, and intimidation that had kept people silent too long. Apparently, I wasn't the only one dealing with Miley's creative community leadership. The new acting chairwoman, Sarah Martinez, was everything Miley wasn't: transparent, collaborative, genuinely interested in serving rather than controlling. One of her first acts was auditing HOA finances, revealing Miley had been padding utility bills and maintenance expenses for years, pocketing the difference. Over $30,000 in unauthorized charges over 3 years. Suddenly, my sewage problem looked like one small part of a much larger criminal enterprise. And here I thought she was just trying to save money on septic pumping. I found myself taking a leadership role in organizing community meetings and helping establish new governance procedures. It felt good to use my law enforcement background for something positive, helping people understand their rights and documenting complaints properly. We implemented term limits for board positions, required financial transparency reports, and established clear procedures for residents to appeal HOA decisions. Most importantly, we created an environment where people felt safe speaking up about problems without fear of retaliation. It was like watching a neighborhood transform from a dictatorship into an actual community. But Miley wasn't going quietly. Even suspended from official authority, she was working behind the scenes to salvage her reputation and avoid the mounting legal consequences. She spread rumors about my mental state, claiming I was a disgruntled ex-cop who couldn't handle retirement and was taking out my frustrations on innocent neighbors. She reached out to her remaining allies, trying to convince them that she was the victim of a coordinated attack by people who didn't understand traditional community values. Maybe I should have just walked away at that point, but honestly, the woman had pumped sewage onto my property for months. I wasn't feeling particularly charitable about her reputation rehabilitation efforts. The breaking point came when I learned that, despite all the legal trouble and community backlash, Miley was planning an elaborate garden party for the following weekend. She'd invited several prominent local business owners, politicians, and social figures, apparently hoping to rehabilitate her image through a display of elegant hospitality. The invitation, which I saw posted on a community bulletin board, described it as a celebration of neighborhood harmony and traditional values. The audacity was breathtaking. She was literally trying to host a public relations event while facing federal charges for environmental crimes. But you know what? Sometimes the universe provides perfect opportunities for poetic justice. That's when I decided that Miley needed one final lesson about consequences, and I knew exactly how to deliver it. I had a friend from my law enforcement days who ran a septic pumping service, and I gave him a call to discuss some timing coordination for Miley's property. You see, with all the legal requirements and soil remediation work, her septic system was under close government monitoring, which meant it needed to be pumped on a very specific schedule to prevent further violations. And wouldn't you know it, that schedule just happened to require emergency service right around the time of her fancy garden party. Amazing how these scheduling conflicts work out sometimes. The day of the party, I positioned myself on my back porch with a clear view of Miley's yard. She'd clearly spent a fortune on decorations, catering, and what looked like professional landscaping to make everything perfect. White tablecloths, elegant flower arrangements, string lights hung between the trees. It was actually quite beautiful. Guests began arriving around 2 o'clock, all dressed in their finest clothes and clearly impressed by the elegant setup. Miley was in her element, playing the gracious hostess and working hard to convince everyone that she was the victim of unfortunate misunderstandings. The performance was really quite something to watch. Around 3:30, just as the party was reaching its peak, I heard the rumble of a large truck approaching. The emergency septic services vehicle came around the corner and pulled directly into Miley's driveway, its diesel engine creating a mechanical roar that completely disrupted the gentle conversation and classical music she'd been playing. I watched through my window as her face went from confusion to horror as she realized what was about to happen in front of all her distinguished guests. And let me tell you, the timing couldn't have been more perfect if I'd planned it myself, which I absolutely did not do because that would be wrong. The septic truck crew got out and began setting up their equipment with professional efficiency. They had to pump her system immediately to prevent further environmental violations. It was a legal requirement that couldn't be postponed even for social events. The smell hit within minutes. That unmistakable, overwhelming stench of raw sewage being processed filled the air across her entire property. I watched guests covering their noses with napkins, looking around in confusion and disgust, trying to figure out where the horrible smell was coming from. Some of them actually started backing away from the food tables, which was probably a wise decision under the circumstances. But the best part was the visual spectacle. The septic truck had to position itself right next to the elegant party area, its industrial pumping equipment creating a stark contrast with the white tablecloths and flower arrangements. The crew had to run their suction hoses across the yard, disrupting the perfect landscaping and creating a scene that was impossible to ignore or explain away. Miley stood there in her designer dress, surrounded by her carefully curated guest list, while a truck literally pumped sewage from her property in front of everyone. You couldn't have scripted a more perfect metaphor for her entire situation. Within 20 minutes, the party was over. Guests made polite excuses and fled to their cars, clearly eager to escape both the smell and the awkwardness of the situation. I watched Miley desperately trying to maintain her composure, attempting to explain to the departing guests that this was just routine maintenance that had been poorly scheduled. But everyone could see exactly what was happening. The woman who had been accused of illegal sewage dumping was now having her septic system pumped in front of half the social elite of the county. Now, some of you might think I went too far with this final move, but after months of literal sewage in my yard, what would you have done? The irony was perfect. Miley had tried to use an elegant social gathering to convince people that she was a respectable community leader who had been unfairly accused of disgusting behavior. Instead, she ended up literally surrounded by the smell and machinery of sewage processing, while her reputation crumbled in real time. Word of the disaster spread through local social circles, within hours cementing her reputation as someone whose poor judgment had literally brought sewage into contact with refined society. Sometimes justice isn't just served, it's served with a side of poetic irony that's so perfect you almost feel bad for laughing. Almost. As the septic truck finally finished and drove away, I saw Miley standing alone in her destroyed party setup, still wearing her expensive dress, but now surrounded by the industrial aftermath of sewage pumping. Her social rehabilitation attempt had become a public demonstration of exactly why she was facing environmental charges in the first place. Justice was done. But as she turned back to glare at me one last time, I realized something: she wasn't finished. Standing there watching her party collapse, I felt a satisfaction deeper than any arrest I'd ever made. But I also realized this neighborhood would never feel like home after everything that had happened. Weeks passed. The house was quiet, but my mind still replayed every scene. Miley now faced criminal charges, a $25,000 fine, expensive environmental cleanup, complete social ostracism, and loss of all neighborhood influence. Justice had been served comprehensively on every level. Her financial situation was desperate. Her reputation destroyed, her power completely stripped away. Her house went up for sale within a month, though finding buyers proved difficult given the environmental liens and legal complications surrounding the property. Meanwhile, our community was thriving under new leadership. Sarah Martinez had organized the most transparent and democratic HOA governance anyone could remember. Financial records were published monthly. Board meetings were open to all residents, and decisions were made through actual discussion and voting, rather than unilateral declarations from a single authoritarian figure. Property values in the neighborhood actually increased as word spread that we'd cleaned house and established proper community management. It was like watching a small-scale version of how democracy is supposed to work, when people actually participate instead of just letting bullies run everything. I found myself genuinely enjoying the role I'd accidentally fallen into as a community advocate and informal advisor on governance issues. Using my law enforcement background to help neighbors understand their rights and document complaints properly felt more rewarding than anything I'd done during my actual police career. We'd created something positive from what had started as a disgusting and infuriating situation. But despite all the positive changes and community improvements, I was harboring a secret that I hadn't shared with anyone. And when I finally revealed it, everyone was going to be shocked. 3 months after Miley's final humiliation, I called a special community meeting and made an announcement that shocked everyone who attended. I was selling my cabin and moving to a different state. The room went completely quiet as people tried to process what I'd just said. After all, I'd won a decisive victory, helped transform our community governance, and earned the respect and gratitude of practically every resident. Why would I leave just when everything was finally working the way it should? Sarah Martinez looked like she'd been personally betrayed, and Robert Peterson actually asked if I was feeling all right. For the first time in months, I could breathe without looking over my shoulder. Yes, I'd achieved complete victory over Miley and her abuses of authority. Yes, the community was now functioning better than it had in years. But every single day when I walked out my back door or worked in my garden, I was reminded of months of breathing sewage-contaminated air and dealing with a level of neighbor conflict that had fundamentally changed how I felt about the place. The smell was gone, but the memory of violation and betrayal lingered in ways I hadn't expected. Maybe if I'd been younger, or if this had been my longtime family home, I could have moved past it. But then I revealed the part of my plan that made everyone gasp with appreciation for the strategic thinking involved. I'd already found buyers for my property, a young couple named David and Jennifer Walsh, both of whom were professional environmental scientists with advanced degrees in soil chemistry and water quality management. They worked for a consulting firm that specialized in detecting and documenting environmental violations for government agencies and private clients. They were moving to our area specifically because they wanted to live somewhere they could monitor environmental health with scientific precision. And yes, they just happened to be related to the EPA inspector who had handled Miley's case. The beauty of this arrangement became clear as I explained their qualifications and interests. David specialized in groundwater contamination detection and had equipment that could identify pollutants at parts per million levels. Jennifer's expertise was in soil chemistry and biological contamination, with particular experience in septic system failures and illegal waste disposal. Together, they represented the kind of environmental monitoring capability that would make any future violations impossible to hide and extremely expensive for whoever committed them. It was like installing a permanent early warning system for environmental crimes staffed by people with direct connections to every relevant government agency. Miley was now trapped in a house she couldn't afford to maintain, couldn't easily sell due to legal complications, and couldn't use for any environmental crimes because her new neighbors were professional pollution detectors with federal agency contacts. Her aging septic system, which was already under legal scrutiny, would now be monitored by people who could identify problems before they became visible to the naked eye. Any attempt to resume her old behavior would be detected, documented, and reported with the kind of scientific precision that would hold up in federal court. It was the perfect long-term solution to make sure she could never victimize another neighbor the same way. The sale moved quickly. I didn't need to stay. Not anymore. A week before I moved out, I was loading boxes into my truck when I heard a familiar rumble from next door. Another septic pumping truck had arrived at Miley's house, the third one in 2 months. Her system, compromised by years of illegal modifications and neglect, now required frequent and expensive maintenance just to meet basic legal requirements. As I watched her standing in her yard writing another check she could barely afford to a septic service company, I saw David Walsh setting up some kind of monitoring equipment along our shared property line. He noticed me watching and walked over to introduce himself properly. "I wanted to thank you again for all the documentation you provided during our property research," he said, gesturing toward the sophisticated scientific equipment he was installing. Your case study of environmental violations will actually be useful for training purposes in our consulting work. We've never seen such thorough evidence collection from a non-professional. He paused, looking toward Miley's house where the septic truck was still working. And don't worry about ongoing monitoring. Our equipment will detect any environmental problems immediately, and we have direct reporting protocols with EPA and state agencies. Driving away from that community for the last time, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my early days in law enforcement: complete satisfaction with a case closed properly. Behind me, Miley faced years of financial struggle, legal probation, social isolation, and environmental monitoring by professional scientists who would catch any violations instantly. She'd never be able to victimize another neighbor the same way, and the community she'd tried to control through fear and manipulation was now thriving under Democratic leadership. The new residents would make sure that nothing like this ever happened again, because they had the professional expertise and government connections to detect and stop environmental crimes before they could harm anyone. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting out while making sure the person who wronged you faces lasting consequences that prevent them from hurting anyone else the same way. I'd one completely justice-served, community-protected villain permanently neutralized, and my own peace of mind restored in a place where the air smelled clean and neighbors treated each other with basic human decency. As the mountain scenery disappeared in my rearview mirror, I could see Miley's house one last time, the septic truck still working in her driveway, while David Walsh's environmental monitoring equipment stood guard along the property line. As I closed the trunk, she slowed her car at the edge of my driveway. Our eyes locked, but this time I didn't look away. And that's the thing: some people think walking away is weakness. But sometimes it's the cleanest move you'll ever make. The truth is, this wasn't just a neighbor dispute. It was a test of what happens when power gets abused in broad daylight, and whether anyone's willing to call it out. Maybe the real lesson here is, justice doesn't always show up in uniform. Sometimes it looks like a camera, a clipboard, or a calm man who's had enough. If you're still here, I'd love to hear your take. Was she out of line, or did I push it too far? And hey, if you like this story and want to keep the channel going, you can always hit that little thanks button below. Thanks for hanging out. Stay sharp out there.
QA Stories signing off for now, but the drama, it never sleeps. Tap that bell if you're ready for round 2.